Dear learners, I welcome you to this class on regional instruments of human rights. In the regional instruments of human rights, we have included three regional mechanism or arrangements of promotion and protection of human rights. The first was the European Convention on Human Rights that we discussed in detail. Then the American Convention on Human Rights, we just finished that discussion. And after that, today or in this lecture, we are going to deal with African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So today we will be discussing the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. First of all, we will be introducing how it was adopted and what is the significance of this particular charter so far as the promotion of human rights in Africa is concerned. And then we will discuss its preamble and significant provisions. In our previous lectures, we discussed the two regional arrangements of human rights protection, namely the European Convention on Human Rights and the African Charter on Human Rights. Today we will discuss the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Hereafter the African Charter, means we will be mentioning most of the time the African Charter. So, which is a regional instrument to promote and protect human rights in the African continent. So after Europe and Americas, we are going to discuss the protection of human rights in African continent, and that is through regional arrangement. The discussion on the African Charter will also give us a better understanding of the universalism and cultural relativism debate. So, that we have been mentioning right from the very beginning when we were discussing the nature of rights, content of rights, catalog of rights. So, the nature, content and catalog of rights, how they vary. And here you will find when we are discussing the African Charter, you will find certain rights and duties that are being emphasized. They are different from the European and the American conventions. That shows that we have a kind of diversity in the world. So the diversity of situation, diversity of geography, diversity of people, that everything should be recognized while understanding the human rights discourse. The African Charter. This African Charter was, the Organization of African Unity adopted the African Charter on Human and People's Rights in 1981. The organization of, this was the Organization of African Unity. The Organization of African Unity has been replaced by the African Union in 2002. So, earlier it was the Organization of African Unity, but since 2002, it is known as African Union, like the European Union. The African Charter is also known as the Banjul Charter, as it was drafted by the OAU, that is Organization of African Unity at that time, in Banjul, Gambia. So that is why it is also called, Banjul Charter. The African Charter entered into force on 21st October 1986. Since then, 21 October is celebrated as African Human Rights Day. You see the significance. To commemorate the occasion that, this is the day when the African Charter on Human Rights entered into force. So you'll find people in Africa, they celebrate African Human Rights Day on 21st October every year since 1986. Like the Human Rights Day, International Human Rights Day, we celebrate on 10th December to commemorate, that signifies what? The 10th December 1948, when the UDHR, that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was adopted, which is of course the Magna Carta of mankind. So International Human Rights Day is celebrated. Here you will find that besides the International Human Rights Day, to signify the date on which the UDHR was adopted by the UN General Assembly, here you will find that the African Charter entered into force on 21st October 1986, and since then 21 October is celebrated as African Human Rights Day. The this African Charter on Human and People Rights has been ratified by 54 member states of the African Union. So there are 54 member states that are party to it. For monitoring and implementing human rights, the African Charter provided for the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which has both promotional and protective functions. So, that is the first body to implement and enforce human rights, to monitor human rights, and that is mentioned in the Charter. So, here this is African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which has both promotional and protective functions. The African Charter did not create a human rights court initially. In the beginning, this was the only body responsible, that was the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, was the body to implement or to promote and protect human rights. So initially it did not have a court. It was argued, and interesting, you see here you can find the element of culture specific rights. What was the argument when they did not have this court? It was so the if they did not have a court, it was not by it was not by accident. It was by design. It was intentional. It was deliberate. So what was the argument that was advanced at that time? It was argued that African customs and traditions have long emphasized mediation, conciliation, and consensus rather than the adversarial and adjudicative procedures that are common to Western legal systems. Interesting, you see that what the African people are saying, that the mediation, conciliation, and consensus is better than the adversarial legal mechanism that is part and parcel of the Western legal system. So they say it is not good to have adversarial and adjudicative procedures under the Charter, because what are African values? That under the African values, tradition, and custom, you'll find that conciliation and mediation is promoted, not the the legal procedure, which is quite cumbersome and in many cases quite expensive as well. However, the African Code of Human and People's Rights came into existence in 2004 to render judgments on the compliance by member states with African Charter. But you see that the journey, you see that it was not having that. Initially, it was not having African Code, but now it has come into existence under the African Charter on Human Rights, and this is the African Code of Human and People's Rights. So both the the organs are there to implement human rights. That is the African Commission on Human Rights, and then the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and then the African Code of Human and People's Rights. The African Charter has a preamble, 3 parts, 4 chapters, and 63 articles. The African Charter includes first, second, and third generation human rights. Third generation human rights have been also included. You see the representing the aspiration of the global south, and that's why it also includes third generation human rights, not only first and second generation of human rights. It also includes a separate chapter on duties. The duties are mentioned here in African tradition. We have been talking about the non-Western tradition, and we discussed that in the non-Western tradition we find that not only rights but duties are emphasized, and that is why they are called duty-centered or duty-based tradition, and that is being reflected here. So it also includes a separate chapter on duties. So it has 4 chapters. One chapter is devoted to duties. Interestingly, the African Charter commits to eliminating colonialism, imperialism. Colonialism and imperialism, that of course Africa was colonized. So the imperialist onslaught was there. Its resources were drained away, and the people were exploited. Racism, slave trade, all these things were there. So since they had tested the bitterness of colonialism and imperialism, so that is why the Charter itself commits to eliminate colonialism and imperialism. And interestingly, Zionism and apartheid. So Zionism has been also specifically mentioned. You see today what is happening, that the Gaza-Israel war that is going on, it is South Africa that is trying to bring Israel to book by moving to international court. So that is again important. So it commits to eliminate not only colonialism and imperialism but apartheid. South Africa was a victim of apartheid, or most of the Africa was victim of racial discrimination, slave trade, etc. And here you will find that it is also mentioning that elimination of Zionism. Now we are coming to the main provisions, and first of all, the African the Charter's preamble, and we have to understand the preamble in its letter and spirit, and that will also make us understand the cultural diversity and cultural specific rights. So the African states members of the Organization of African Unity, parties to the present convention entitled the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, recalling decision 115 of the Assembly of Heads of State and Government at its 16th ordinary session held in Monrovia, Liberia from 17 to 20 July 1979 on the preparation of a preliminary draft on an African Charter on Human and People's Rights, providing inter alia for the establishment of bodies to promote and protect human and people's rights. Considering the Charter of the Organization of African Unity, which stipulates the freedom, equality, justice, you see what is being emphasized? Freedom, equality, justice, and dignity are essential objectives for the achievement of the legitimate aspirations of the African peoples. You see the tone and tenor. So, what is important? Freedom, of course, liberty, freedom, national liberation struggles, you should remember. Equality, racial discrimination was practiced, apartheid was practiced. So, justice and dignity, dignified treatment was not given to the Africans. They were treated as slaves. The slave trade, they were being sold as commodities in the market. So, are essential objectives for the achievement of the legitimate aspirations of the African peoples. Again, reaffirming the pledge they solemnly made in Article 2 of the said Charter to eradicate all forms of colonialism from Africa. Africa was a victim of colonialism, that is being mentioned here. To coordinate and intensify their cooperation and efforts to achieve a better life for the peoples of Africa, and to promote international cooperation having due regard to the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You see, UN Charter being cited, and again, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is being cited. So that's why it is called Common Standard of Achievement for all people and all nations. And that is why we have been highlighting that it is the most cited human rights instrument. So everywhere you will find in all the regional mechanism of human rights, you will find UDHR has been cited. Taking into consideration the virtues of their historical tradition and the values of African civilization, which should inspire and characterize their reflection on the concept of human and people's rights. You see, the civilizational values. It means that the rights that they are proclaiming through this charter, they are deeply rooted in the African civilization. Africa as a civilization is being, conceptualized and conceived here. And they say that taking into consideration the virtues of their historical tradition and values of African civilization. We were saying, already that what is there? That the reconciliation is more important there. Conciliation, mediation, consensus, that is important rather than indulging in legal cases and expensive, legal process. So they are highlighting here. Recognizing on the one hand the fundamental human rights stem from the attributes of human beings, by virtue of being we all have certain human rights, which justifies their international protection, and on the other hand that the reality and respect of people's rights should necessarily guarantee human rights, that is again being highlighted, considering that the enjoyment of rights and freedoms also implies the performance of duties on the part of everyone. So every right has a corresponding duty. So rights and duties go together, that is being emphasized here. Convinced that it is henceforth essential to pay a particular attention to the right to development. You see, group rights, third generation rights, that is being mentioned here in the preamble itself. It was not there in the European Convention, it was not there in the American Convention, but you will find it is here in the African Convention. So, convinced that it is henceforth essential to pay a particular attention to the right to development, and the civil and political rights cannot be, and that civil and political rights cannot be dissociated from economic, social, and cultural rights in their conception as well as universality, and that the satisfaction of economic, social, and cultural rights is a guarantee for the enjoyment of civil and political rights. Interesting, you see. That first of all, the global south has been asserting right from the very beginning that, the international economic order is not equal, not based on justice, and that is being asserted in this African, charter. And that's why the third generation human rights, that is right to development, is being mentioned. And it is also being observed that what they are asserting, that the civil and political rights cannot be understood, realized, conceptualized, visualized in isolation from economic, social, and cultural rights. Rather, they cannot be enjoyed if the economic, social, and cultural rights are not available to the people. Again, you see the next paragraph, conscious of their duty to achieve the total liberation of Africa. You see, total liberation of Africa. The peoples of which are still struggling for their dignity and genuine independence. These words you must mark. The total liberation of Africa, number one. It is not only the political freedom that is important. Total liberation of Africa. Then again, the peoples of which are still struggling for their dignity and genuine independence. Dignity and genuine independence. It means neo-colonialism, new imperialism. They are still the victim of exploitation by the major powers of the world that they are trying to highlight. And undertaking to eliminate colonialism. Number one, colonialism, then neo-colonialism. Means colonialism and imperialism in all its forms and manifestations. It may be, for example, in the colonialism, what used to happen, that the political subjugation was must for economic exploitation. Now, because of an unjust international economic order or political order, for example, you see the UN Security Council. No African country is represented in the UN Security Council. So it means that the global order is not favorable to Africa. So that is why what they are, genuine independence, you see, total liberation of Africa, and then talking about undertaking to eliminate colonialism and neo-colonialism. The international financial and trade institutions, how they are exploiting the poor countries of the world. All these things you can understand. Then neo-colonialism, then apartheid and Zionism, and to dismantle aggressive foreign military bases and all forms of discrimination, particularly those based on race, ethnic group, color, sex, language, religion, or political opinions. This paragraph is very important. It is manifesting the aspirations, sentiments, and the ambitions of the African people. So that is why this paragraph must be marked by all of you. This is very, very important. Reaffirming their adherence to the principle of human and people's rights and freedoms contained in the declarations, convention, and other instruments adopted by the Organization of African Unity, the movement of non-aligned countries, and the United Nations. You see the reality of the Cold War. It was adopted at that time when the Cold War was already there. So we will find that the world was divided into two hostile blocks, the capitalist and the socialist bloc. But a good number of countries from Africa and Asia and Latin America, they were under what is called the non-aligned movement. India, our own country, was the pioneer of this movement. Jawaharlal Nehru was one of the most respected leaders of the non-aligned movement. We commanded a lot of respect in the international arena because of this movement and the leadership that we provided to these countries. So it is being mentioned, the non-aligned movement, and of course the United Nations. Firmly convinced of their duty to promote and protect human and people's rights and freedom, taking into account the importance traditionally attached to these rights and freedoms in Africa, have agreed as follows. Now we are coming to, after the preamble, we are coming to the provisions that are there in the charter. So number one, part one, that is dealing with rights and duties. This is the part 1. And we are going to discuss chapter 1, human and people's rights. This chapter 1 is dealing with rights. So article 1, that is saying the member states of the Organization of African Unity, parties to the present charter, shall recognize the rights, duties and freedoms enshrined in this charter and shall undertake to adopt legislative or other measures to give effect to them. So it's an international, arrangement, means regional arrangement. So the domestic law must be there, corresponding domestic law. So they are undertaking that they will have their adopt legislative or other measures to give effect to them. The rights that are mentioned in the charter, there will be domestic legislation, means national laws, or in the constitutions of these countries, they will be included. Article 2. Every individual shall be entitled to the enjoyment of the rights and freedoms recognized and granted in the present charter, without distinction of any kind, such as race, ethnic group, color, sex, language, religion, political or any other opinion, national and social origin, fortune, birth, or other status. From the African point of view, this claim of absolute equality is very important, because they have been the victim of inequality, discriminatory treatment on the basis of race and color. So that is why, again, this Article 2 is important in the context of the history of Africa. Article 3. Every individual shall be equal before the law. This is there in all the conventions. Article 4. Every individual shall be entitled to equal protection of the law. So equality before the law and equal protection of the law. Article 4. Human beings are inviolable. Every human being shall be entitled to respect for his life and the integrity of his person. No one may be arbitrarily deprived of this right. Article 5. Every individual shall have the right to the respect of the dignity inherent in human being and to the recognition of his legal status. All forms of exploitation and degradation of man, particularly slavery, slave trade. You see, slavery and slave trade have been there. African people were subjected to slave trade, slavery, servitude. So it is being highlighted, all forms of exploitation and degradation of man. Slavery is degradation of man. There is no doubt in it, and that is being asserted in this, in this regional arrangement, that all forms of exploitation and degradation of man, particularly slavery, slave trade, torture, cruel, inhuman or degrading punishment and treatment shall be prohibited. Article 6. Every individual shall have the right to liberty and to the security of his person. No one may be deprived of his freedom except for reasons and conditions previously laid down by law. In particular, no one may be arbitrarily arrested or detained. So, means there must be some kind of law. So, on the basis of, the arrest or detention must be lawful. It should not be on the personal whim or will of the powerful people or the ruling class. Article 7. Every individual shall have the right to have his cause heard. This comprises the right to an appeal to competent national organs against acts of violating his fundamental rights as recognized and granted by the conventions, laws, regulations, and customs in force. There are many things, they may not be the part of law, but the customs in force, the recognition of the custom and tradition. The right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty by a competent court or tribunal. We were talking about the media trials. We were talking about the era of post-truth, where you see the baseless charges can be leveled against people and they can be, detained by the authorities. And then the media trials start, and there are many people who are, then the cases are there in the court and the court declares them innocent, and they are released from the jail, but the taboo that is attached by the media, it goes with them. So that is why this is again important. The right to defense, including the right to be defended by counsel of his choice. So the professional lawyer can be hired, of course. The right to be tried within a reasonable time by an impartial court or tribunal. Again, this is important. You see, what is the situation in our country? There are many people who were detained, in charges of treason, or you can say terrorism, militancy, etc. And these people, they were declared by the court after 20 years of imprisonment, they were declared innocent. So, this delay in the criminal justice system that leads to colossal violation of the colossal violation of the rights of the innocent people. So, that is being emphasized here, the right to be tried within a reasonable time by an impartial court or tribunal. So, under such kind of cases, of course, you see, for example, if there is a person who is behind the bars for 20 years and after that, if he is released and declared innocent by the court, there must be some kind of compensation. So, that compensatory justice must be there. So, human rights organizations, they are demanding, and we must be sensitized about that, that it cannot be accepted in a country where the human rights culture is being promoted. So, this is being highlighted over there, but this is useful for all the countries and all the peoples wherever they are living and facing this kind of problems. No one may be condemned for an act or omission which did not constitute a legally punishable offense at the time it was committed. So again, ipso facto legislation is not applicable. No penalty may be inflicted for an offense for which no provision was made at the time it was committed. Punishment is personal and can be imposed only on the offender. Only on the offender. It means if a person has committed a crime, then he should be, punished, not his family members, his community, his clan, his tribe, his, locality. That is being here emphasized. Article 8. Freedom of conscience, the profession and free practice of religion shall be granted. No one may be subject to law and order be submitted to measures restricting the exercise of these freedoms. Again, these freedoms will be available, but subject to law and order, of course. Article 9. Every individual shall have the right to receive information. Every individual shall have the right to express and disseminate his opinions within the law. So, right to receive information. In our country, we have a very strong Right to Information Act, and which is one of the biggest achievement of Indian democracy. So, Right to Information Act, under which you can get the information from the government, most of the information that you can get. So here, what is being highlighted here, that every individual shall have the right to receive information, and every individual shall have the right to express and disseminate his opinion within the law. Article 10. Every individual shall have the right to free association provided that he abides by the law. Within the ambit of law, that should be there. Subject to the obligation of solidarity provided for in Article 29, no one may be compelled to join an association. So you see, again, important. What is subject to the obligation of solidarity provided? The solidarity of the African people. That solidarity may be against apartheid, that may be against Zionism, that may be against, colonialism or neo-colonialism, which has already been mentioned. So that's subject to the obligation of solidarity provided for in Article 29. That is the only exception. No one may be compelled to join an association. Article 11. Every individual shall have the right to assemble freely with others. The exercise of his right shall be subject only to necessary restrictions provided for by law, in particular those enacted in the interest of national security, the safety, health, ethics, and rights and freedoms of others. Again, national security and safety clause that is being applied for restricting, the right to assembly. Article 12. Every individual shall have the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of a state, provided he abides by the law. Every individual shall have the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. This right may only be subject to restrictions provided for by law for the protection of national security, law and order, public health, or morality. Certain exceptions, that have been accepted, but at the same time, right to movement and right to leave the country and then coming back to that country, that have been recognized. Every individual shall have the right, when persecuted, to seek and obtain asylum in other countries in accordance with the law of those countries and international conventions. Right to seek asylum has been ensured, because many times you will find people are persecuted for their political opinion, for their political ideology, for their voice of conscience. So that is under that kind of cases, what has been recognized, that they have a right to asylum. A non-national legally admitted in a territory of a state party to the present charter may only be expelled from it by virtue of a decision taken in accordance with the law. Again, the mass expulsion of non-nationals shall be prohibited. Mass expulsion of non-nationals shall be prohibited. Mass expulsion shall be that which is aimed at national, racial, ethnic, or religious groups. This is very important in the context of Africa, where you'll find a lot of ethnic conflict is there. So that is why, keeping in view the problems and challenges of African people, this has been emphasized, and this is again important provision that mass expulsion of non-national shall be prohibited. So, what may happen, for example, if there is a conflict and the conflict is ethnic, then the people, those who are at the receiving end, especially women, children, old men, they may migrate or they may enter into other countries. So, if they are living over there and the conditions are not good for them to go back to their own country, so that mass expulsion cannot be there. This is again important in the context of Africa. Article 13. Every citizen shall have the right to participate freely in the government of his country, either directly or through freely chosen representative in accordance with the provisions of the law. It means it is whether direct democracy or indirect democracy, but democracy is being emphasized. Every citizen shall have the right of equal access to the public service of his country. Again, public employment that should be available to all the people without any discrimination. Every individual shall have the right of access to public property and services in a strict equality of all persons before the law. No racial discrimination can be practiced. You see a country, a continent which has been facing racial discrimination, apartheid, again this provision is important. Then the right to property shall be granted. It may only be encroached upon in the interest of public need or in the general interest of the community and in accordance with the provisions of appropriate laws. So, it is not absolute right again, but it can be, it may only be encroached upon. You see, this is mentioned here. Of course, for the common good or for the larger interest of the community, etc. Article 15. Every individual shall have the right to work under equitable and satisfactory conditions and shall receive equal pay for equal work. So, this economic right that is being emphasized here. With this, we are going to conclude our lecture today on the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. We'll continue. So, we have already discussed the preamble and then the significant provisions like all these provisions up to from Article 1 to Article 15. Other provisions we'll discuss in the next lecture, and we will also discuss the implementation mechanism, and then we'll try to conclude our discussion on the regional arrangements of human rights. Thank you.